Today, we are going to explore the most brutal revenge killings ever recorded. From a betrayed business partner who watched his former friend drown in cold waters, to a grieving father whose quest for justice turned him into the very monster he sought to destroy. It was October 14th, 2015, and the autumn evening cast long shadows across a private marina in Seattle, where local business owners and investors gathered for their monthly networking event. The docks buzzed with clinking glasses and quiet conversations as guests celebrated another successful quarter. Trevor Blackwood adjusted his designer suit as he mingled among the crowd on his 60-foot yacht, his confident smile masking months of building anxiety. At 42, the successful software entrepreneur had built his reputation on innovation and trustworthiness, but behind the facade lay financial crimes that threatened to destroy everything. His software company had become one of Seattle's most promising startups, but Trevor had been secretly siphoning funds into offshore accounts for over 2 years. Trevor's former business partner and childhood friend, Daniel Rodriguez, had discovered the embezzlement 6 months earlier when inconsistencies led to a devastating audit. The betrayal had cost Daniel his life savings, home, marriage, and custody of his 2 young children. Daniel had trusted Trevor completely, even signing over temporary power of attorney while hospitalized for surgery, a decision Trevor quietly used to access company accounts. The discovery had sent Daniel into a downward spiral of depression and rage. Forced to move into his car after losing his house, he worked menial jobs while his former partner continued living in luxury. For 8 months, Daniel had been planning his revenge, studying Trevor's routines and learning he hosted yacht club gatherings on the second Tuesday of every month. Daniel had secured a position with the catering company servicing the events, working legitimate jobs for months to establish cover, while fantasizing about confronting the man who destroyed his life. That evening, Daniel arrived wearing the catering uniform, his face hidden beneath a baseball cap as he carried trays through the crowd. He watched Trevor for over an hour, waiting for the perfect moment when his former partner would be alone. The opportunity came when Trevor stepped onto the yacht's upper deck for a private phone call. According to Daniel's later confession to investigators, he followed up the narrow stairs, heart pounding as he prepared for the confrontation he had rehearsed countless times. When Trevor ended his call and turned around, the shock of recognition was immediate. Daniel revealed bank statements and transfer records proving the extent of Trevor's financial crimes. Trevor's surprise quickly turned to arrogance as he dismissed Daniel's accusations and threatened to have him arrested for trespassing. The callous response triggered something primal in Daniel, who lunged at his former friend with years of pent-up rage. The 2 men struggled violently near the yacht's railing, their fight hidden from party guests below. During the struggle, Trevor lost his footing and fell backward over the railing, plunging 15 feet into the dark waters of Puget Sound. Daniel watched in stunned silence as Trevor thrashed in the cold water, calling for help that Daniel chose not to provide. Within minutes, Trevor had disappeared beneath the surface. Daniel calmly returned to his catering duties. The splash had gone unheard amid the music and chatter from nearby boats, and by the time anyone realized Trevor was missing, nearly an hour had passed. Security cameras captured Daniel leaving at shift's end, but the death was initially ruled accidental drowning. The guilt consumed Daniel over following weeks, driving him to send anonymous tips that directed investigators back to Trevor's financial crimes. When police traced the emails to Daniel's work computer, he confessed, saying Trevor's death brought him no satisfaction. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. It was June 7, 2016, and the summer heat in Nashville reached 89 degrees as the city's music industry prepared for another busy evening. In the affluent Belle Meade neighborhood, sprawling homes sat quietly behind manicured lawns and wrought iron gates. Sarah Morrison stood in her granite kitchen, carefully preparing her husband's favorite meal, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. At 45, the former registered nurse had spent 15 years married to Bradley Morrison, a successful country music producer whose infidelities had finally pushed her beyond the breaking point. Her medical background had given her access to knowledge that most scorned wives could never obtain. Sarah's discovery of Bradley's affairs had begun 3 months earlier, when she found explicit messages on his phone. The evidence revealed a pattern of cheating involving multiple women from the music industry. Bradley had been using their joint accounts to fund expensive gifts, and weekend getaways with his mistresses, spending money Sarah had helped earn through her nursing career. The betrayal had been devastating, but Sarah's response was methodical. She spent weeks documenting evidence while pretending to work on their marriage, secretly researching difficult-to-detect compounds during night shifts at a Nashville hospital. She obtained the compound through an anonymous online purchase, later traced to an account registered to the household. Her pharmaceutical knowledge provided the perfect weapon. According to her later confession, Sarah had chosen a slow-acting neurotoxin that would mimic heart attack symptoms, difficult to detect in standard autopsies. She practiced timing and dosage for weeks, calculating the exact amount needed to ensure Bradley's death while avoiding suspicion. That evening, she served Bradley his anniversary dinner with his favorite wine, into which she had mixed the compound. Phone logs and timestamps later confirmed the timing Sarah described. She sat with him for about 30 minutes as he began showing signs of distress. Bradley reportedly attributed his chest pains to stress from work and discussed his latest recording project, unaware his wife was orchestrating his death. Sarah expressed concern and suggested he rest, maintaining her composure as his condition deteriorated. Records show she waited 12 minutes before calling 911, ensuring paramedics would arrive too late. When first responders entered, she was performing CPR and providing medical details with professional precision. Bradley was pronounced dead 45 minutes later. Initial results listed cardiac arrest, but extended toxicology, ordered after examiners noted unusual organ markers, detected trace amounts of a rare cardiac-affecting compound. Sarah's medical background initially made her seem unlikely, but her documentation of Bradley's affairs provided clear motive when police searched their computer. Investigators matched an online purchase traced to the household with microscopic residue recovered from the decanter and confronted Sarah with the evidence. She confessed, explaining she wanted Bradley to experience the same betrayal she had felt. Sarah was sentenced to life without parole, showing no remorse and stating Bradley deserved his fate. It was March 18th, 2014, and the spring afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt parking lot of a Phoenix high school, where the temperature had already reached 95 degrees. The sprawling campus sat empty except for a few cars belonging to teachers and students attending after-school activities, creating the perfect setting for a confrontation that had been building for over 2 years. Nathan Williams sat in his beat-up Honda Civic, watching the school's main entrance through dark sunglasses as he waited for his target to appear. At 16, the quiet sophomore had endured relentless bullying from Kyle Henderson, a popular senior whose torment had escalated from verbal abuse to physical violence and public humiliation. Nathan's grades had suffered, his social life had disappeared, and his mental health had deteriorated to the point where revenge seemed like his only option. Kyle's bullying campaign had begun during Nathan's freshman year, starting with name-calling before evolving into serious harassment. Kyle had recruited other students to participate, creating videos of Nathan being pushed and humiliated that were posted on social media for the entire school to see. The psychological torture had been systematic and cruel, designed to isolate Nathan completely from his peers. Nathan's parents had repeatedly contacted school administrators, but their complaints were dismissed or resulted in ineffective interventions that only made Kyle's behavior worse. The school's anti-bullying policies existed on paper but were rarely enforced, leaving vulnerable students to fend for themselves. The system's failure had pushed Nathan toward increasingly dark thoughts about revenge. Over the past 6 months, Nathan had quietly collected parts and pieced together a crude, improvised explosive device, a weapon investigators later described in vague forensic terms. He'd rehearsed the timing and worked the plan around the school's rhythms. Rather than placing it in the middle of a crowded lunch, Nathan had slipped the device into position during a quieter window earlier that day, when the lot was largely empty. The bomb detonated when Kyle returned to his truck, the blast destroying the vehicle and killing him instantly. The bomb was designed to detonate when Kyle started his engine. Based on surveillance footage and Nathan's later confession, investigators determined that Kyle entered his truck shortly before 4 p.m. Moments after the ignition engaged, a blast erupted from beneath the vehicle, destroying it instantly and killing Kyle on impact. The explosion shattered windows in the nearby school building and damaged several vehicles, creating chaos that brought emergency responders racing to campus. Witnesses later reported seeing Nathan leave the area shortly after the blast. He was arrested 3 hours later at his home, where police recovered a detailed confession letter on his desk. Nathan was charged as an adult with premeditated murder. The school faced intense scrutiny for its failure to address the repeated bullying, and Nathan's parents later filed lawsuits that exposed the administration's negligence. It was December 3rd, 2017, and the winter evening brought an early darkness to downtown Chicago. The city's financial district had already emptied, leaving a 40-story office tower nearly deserted, except for a few guards and employees working late. David Park sat in his rental car in the building's underground parking garage, his hands trembling from both the cold and adrenaline coursing through his veins. At 38, the former accounting manager had spent the last 8 months planning his revenge against Patricia Wells, the human resources director who had destroyed his life by exposing his embezzlement and ensuring his criminal prosecution. David's world had collapsed when Patricia discovered his theft of company funds, leading to his termination, arrest, and the loss of everything he had worked to build. David's embezzlement had started small, with minor adjustments to expense reports and petty cash withdrawals that he justified as compensation for his underpaid position. Over 2 years, the amounts had grown larger as David became more confident in manipulating the company's financial systems. He had been stealing approximately $2,000 per month, money used to maintain his lifestyle and support his family's expensive tastes. Patricia's discovery had been thorough and devastating, revealing not just recent crimes but a pattern of financial manipulation stretching back to David's first year. Her investigation uncovered forged receipts, falsified vendor payments, and unauthorized transfers totaling over $50,000. Patricia had presented the evidence to company executives with clinical precision. The criminal charges that followed destroyed David's marriage, cost him his home, and left him unemployed and unemployable. His wife had taken their children and moved across the country, citing the shame David had brought upon their family. David had been living in a cheap motel for months, working odd jobs and planning revenge against the woman who exposed his crimes. David had been studying the tower's security systems and Patricia's routines for weeks, learning she often worked late on Sunday evenings when the building was nearly empty. According to surveillance footage and recovered evidence, David used a fake security uniform to gain access to the underground garage. Footage later reviewed by investigators showed Patricia's silver BMW pulling into her reserved space near the elevator bank. David approached as she gathered her belongings, his counterfeit badge visible while he claimed there had been reports of suspicious activity. Investigators noted that Patricia appeared momentarily hesitant, but did not realize he was armed. Building cameras and Patricia's phone records confirmed that David forced her into the elevator at gunpoint, pressing the button for the 23rd floor where her office was located. During the tense ride, he instructed her to call her family while holding the weapon to her head. Audio recovered from the call captured Patricia's calm voice as she tried not to alarm her husband. Security logs and hallway footage reconstructed the next sequence. David led Patricia to her office and forced her to sit at her desk while he ranted about his prosecution and the collapse of his family. Patricia remained composed, occasionally attempting to reason with him. When guards responded to reports of shouting from the 23rd floor, David panicked and fired twice before fleeing toward the stairwell. Police body camera footage and incident reports indicated that officers cornered David between the 15th and 16th floors, where he turned the gun on himself rather than surrender. Both victims died from their wounds, closing a chain of events that began with David's decision to steal from his employer. The investigation later exposed serious weaknesses in the tower's access control system and resulted in lawsuits against both the building management company and David's former employer. Patricia's family went on to establish a foundation supporting workplace violence prevention. It was August 29th, 2013, and the late summer heat in Austin reached 102 degrees as the city's vibrant downtown district prepared for another busy evening of dining and entertainment. The popular restaurant scene along South Congress Avenue attracted locals and tourists alike, creating a bustling atmosphere that masked the deadly drama about to unfold in one establishment's parking lot. Elena Vasquez sat in her car across the street from a downtown restaurant, watching through tinted windows as her ex-boyfriend Cameron Rodriguez worked his evening shift as the restaurant's manager. At 27, Elena had been consumed by thoughts of revenge for the 6 months since discovering Cameron's affair with her younger sister Maria, a betrayal that had destroyed not only their 3-year relationship, but also her relationship with her family. The discovery had sent Elena into a spiral of depression and rage that therapy had failed to address. Cameron's affair with Maria had continued for over a year before Elena discovered it. According to later family statements, the two had met frequently at Elena's apartment while she worked her nursing shifts. Family members told investigators that the confrontation that followed was heated and led to a permanent break within the household. After the discovery, Elena became estranged from both her partner and her family. Statements from relatives described how Maria, once her closest confidant, maintained contact with their parents, while Elena withdrew completely. When Maria later announced her pregnancy with Cameron's child, family records show that their parents chose to support her, leaving Elena isolated. Court records show Elena had been seeing a therapist and was prescribed antidepressants during that period. Purchase receipts and range logs confirm she legally bought a .38 caliber revolver and practiced at a local shooting range for several weeks. Friends later told investigators she claimed she was learning self-defense. Investigators found planning notes and messages indicating she intended to confront Cameron in public. Evidence and staff statements established that Cameron typically left the restaurant around 10 p.m. on weeknights with a hostess named Jessica. That predictable routine gave Elena repeated opportunities to observe and plan her approach. That evening, witness statements and security footage later confirmed that Elena waited in the restaurant's parking lot until Cameron and Jessica emerged from the building, laughing and holding hands as they walked toward Cameron's car. Elena approached them with the revolver concealed in her purse. Footage showed her stepping forward and drawing the weapon moments later. Cameron appeared to notice her and stepped in front of Jessica as the confrontation began. Elena fired 6 shots, striking Cameron 4 times in the torso. Jessica screamed and nearby patrons took cover behind parked cars. When the gun was empty, Elena placed it on the ground and sat on the curb, remaining there until police arrived minutes later. She was arrested without resistance and later pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, expressing remorse for the killing, but stating in court that anger over the betrayal had driven her actions. Jessica required extensive therapy to cope with the trauma of witnessing the shooting, while Elena's family was further torn apart by the revelation that Maria's affair had led to murder. Elena was sentenced to life in prison, where she continues to serve her sentence while Cameron's family struggles to understand how a relationship dispute could have escalated to such deadly violence. The restaurant where Cameron worked installed a memorial plaque in his honor and implemented new security measures to protect their staff from similar incidents. It was February 11th, 2018, and the winter snow in Denver had created treacherous driving conditions throughout the city, with black ice covering the roads, where 8-year-old Emma Williams had been struck and killed 6 months earlier. The intersection of Maple Street and 15th Avenue had become a shrine of flowers and teddy bears, a constant reminder to Robert Williams of the daughter he had lost and the justice he had been denied. Robert sat in his pickup truck outside Murphy's Tavern, watching through the frosted windshield as Jonathan Pierce celebrated his 34th birthday with friends inside the dimly lit bar. At 41, the grieving father had spent every day since his daughter's death planning this moment. Court testimony and psychological evaluations later described Robert as fixated on the perceived injustice of the lenient 18-month sentence that Jonathan had received for the hit-and-run accident that had destroyed Robert's world. Court records show the charges were reduced after defense attorneys argued that Pierce's alcoholism required treatment rather than incarceration. Police reports and witness statements later confirmed that Pierce's BMW struck Emma as she crossed Maple Street on a Tuesday morning as she walked to school along her usual route, a path she had taken safely hundreds of times before. Jonathan had been driving home from an all-night drinking session when his vehicle struck Emma at 45 miles per hour, throwing her small body 30 feet into a chain-link fence. Robert had been walking behind Emma, planning to surprise her with a lunch visit at school, and had watched helplessly as his daughter died in his arms while Jonathan fled the scene. The investigation had quickly identified Jonathan through witness descriptions and damage to his vehicle, but his family's wealth and connections had influenced every aspect of his prosecution. Jonathan served only 14 months in a minimum security facility that resembled a country club more than a prison. Robert had attended every court hearing, watching in disbelief as the justice system failed his daughter. Robert's marriage had collapsed under the weight of grief and anger, with his wife Sarah unable to cope with his obsession with revenge and his descent into alcoholism. She had moved to California with their surviving son, leaving Robert alone in the house where Emma's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it. Robert had lost his job as a construction foreman due to his drinking and erratic behavior, spending his days researching Jonathan's activities and planning his revenge. Investigators later found surveillance notes and phone records confirming he had tracked Pierce's movements for weeks before the killing, learning his routines and waiting for the perfect opportunity to confront him. Jonathan had returned to his previous lifestyle of heavy drinking and partying after his release from prison, showing no apparent remorse for Emma's death. That evening, Robert waited in the tavern's parking lot until Jonathan emerged alone, stumbling slightly from the alcohol he had consumed during his birthday celebration. Robert approached him with a tire iron concealed behind his back, his heart pounding as he prepared to avenge his daughter's death. When Jonathan saw Robert approaching, he showed no recognition or concern, treating the encounter as a minor inconvenience. Robert confronted Jonathan about Emma's death, showing him photos of his daughter's funeral and describing the impact of her loss on his family. According to Robert's later confession, Pierce dismissed his accusations and told him to move on, triggering the assault. Witnesses in nearby vehicles reported hearing shouting moments before the assault began. Robert began beating Jonathan with the tire iron while screaming his daughter's name. Robert continued the assault long after Jonathan had stopped moving, his grief and anger pouring out in a frenzy of violence that left Jonathan's body barely recognizable. When his rage was finally spent, Robert sat down next to the body and called 911. Confessing to the murder while waiting for police to arrive. Robert was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the judge acknowledging the emotional circumstances that had led to the crime, while condemning the vigilante justice. The case divided public opinion, with many sympathizing with Robert's grief, while others condemned his decision to take the law into his own hands. Emma's story became a rallying point for stricter drunk driving laws and victims' rights advocacy, ensuring that her death would not be forgotten. It was November 2016 in rural Pennsylvania. The air around the small hillside cemetery stayed damp after a week of rain, and puddles filled the gravel paths between rows of graves. The caretaker, James Holloway, had worked there for 15 years. People in town said no one trimmed grass straighter than him. But that fall, things changed. The cemetery hired a younger man named Darren Lutz as the new head groundsman. Darren had only been there 3 years but was good with reports and safety paperwork. When James got written up for missing logs, he lost his title. Those who knew him said James took it hard. He kept doing his job, mowing and cleaning, but stopped talking to most of the crew. Over time, he started showing up after dark, saying he wanted to finish tasks when no one else was around. It wasn't unusual. The small crew often left the gate keys under the office mat for him, and nobody questioned his habits. The cemetery's new burial section sat downhill near the back fence, supported by a retaining wall that held back soft hillside soil. After several days of rain, water had pooled behind that wall. Darren, now the supervisor, wanted to inspect it for pressure cracks before the weekend. The night before, James was seen walking near that same area with a toolbox. He told a neighbor he was patching erosion. In truth, he had loosened several bolts along the wall's lower row. Most were half buried under clay, so the tampering wasn't visible unless the soil was cleared away. His plan, according to later reports, wasn't to cause a collapse, only to make the wall shift enough to startle Darren. That morning, Darren parked his truck close to the slope to keep his radio in range. The signal often dropped near the fence line. He carried a probe to test the surface and began checking each section. 2 women visiting relatives' graves said they saw him crouching near the center of the wall, speaking into his radio. Moments later, a cracking sound cut through the quiet. The limestone face bowed forward and buckled. A heavy wave of wet clay and rock spilled out, sweeping Darren off his feet and covering him completely. One witness ran toward the main office for help, while the other tried digging with a flower vase from a nearby headstone, but the soil packed too fast. Maintenance staff reached the site minutes later, but the area was unstable. The wall had folded inward, leaving only a section of Darren's jacket visible. Rescue teams worked carefully over the next 2 days, removing the soil by hand to prevent another collapse. When investigators examined the frame, They found several missing bolts and fresh wrench marks on the remaining supports. James didn't return to work after that day. His house was found empty, his truck gone, and his paycheck still uncollected. Police never located the missing bolts or his toolbox. Some believed he panicked and fled. Others thought he'd planned it all along. The cemetery reopened weeks later with a new concrete wall built under county supervision. The area where the collapse happened was leveled and turned into open lawn, no longer used for burials. Locals still remember James Holloway as the quiet man who kept the grass perfect. His old push mower still sits in the shed. Blades rusted but lined up neatly, just the way he used to leave things. It was November 2014 in Alberta, Canada. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and thin ice lined the edges of Highway 22 between Turner Valley and Black Diamond. Constable Ryan Burke, 33, had driven that route for 6 years. Locals knew his patrol car and often waved when he passed. He had a steady reputation, calm with drivers, more likely to issue warnings than tickets. His approach made him well-liked in the small towns spread along the foothills. 2 years earlier, Ryan had been part of a routine stop that ended badly. A wanted suspect resisted arrest, and the chase ended with a crash and a fatal gunfire exchange. Ryan hadn't fired the shot, but he'd been there when the man's brother was taken into custody. The case was closed and the report cleared him. Yet people who followed local news remembered his name. Over time, he went back to quiet patrols, checking speeders, helping with breakdowns, and watching for wildlife that crossed the road after dusk. On November 21st, a little after 9 p.m., the radio logged Ryan's call about a pickup with its hazard lights on near the old bridge curve. He told dispatch he'd check it out before heading back to the detachment. Dashcam footage, later reviewed by investigators, shows the moment his cruiser pulled behind the truck. The flashing lights of his bar reflected against the rear window of the pickup. Ryan stepped out, shining his flashlight toward the driver's side. The road was nearly empty, just distant headlights miles away. Seconds later, the dash cam captured a brief flare and a low popping sound, softer than a normal gunshot because of the wind. The picture jolted, then the camera tilted sideways as the unit hit the pavement. The lens kept recording from the ground, showing the pickup speeding away northbound. A traffic cone caught under its rear tire. A motorist traveling south saw the police lights flicker, then fade. He slowed and noticed the patrol car's door open with no one inside. When he called emergency dispatch, the operator confirmed that no units were expected at that location. Officers and paramedics reached the scene within minutes, finding Ryan near the shoulder beside the vehicle, his radio still clipped to his jacket. He was unresponsive and was taken to the nearest hospital in Black Diamond, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Investigators confirmed he had been struck once in the upper chest at close range. Witnesses at 2 nearby gas stations later described a man who'd been asking questions that week about the officer who killed his brother. One attendant remembered him filling gas cans and driving a gray pickup with mismatched panels. The description matched the vehicle seen in the dashcam. The case remained open for several months, handled by regional and federal teams. Despite searches through nearby properties and vehicle records, the man seen at local gas stations was never found. The abandoned pickup was traced to a junkyard purchase under a false name. The patrol unit was later retired from service, and that section of Highway 22 was added to a list of high-risk stops for single-officer patrols. It was February 2018 on the outskirts of Reno, Nevada. A small roadside motel sat just off the highway, a narrow building with faded paint and a flickering vacancy sign that buzzed through the night. It wasn't much, but it stayed busy enough with travelers and truck drivers passing through. The manager, 29-year-old Sophie Dalton, handled nearly everything herself. She lived in a small room behind the front desk, working long hours to keep the place running. Most nights, she balanced the books, checked cameras, and made sure the laundry room finished before dawn. For several months, the motel had dealt with a troublesome tenant named Leonard Price. He was in his 40s and had rented one of the end units, paying weekly in cash. At first, he kept to himself, but later guests complained about loud music and shouting. Sophie warned him several times before evicting him for unpaid rent and repeated disturbances. Employees later said he didn't take it well. After being kicked out, he parked near the property on several nights, watching the front office from his truck, before driving off when the lights turned off. The motel had an old boiler system that heated water for all the rooms. It sat inside a small utility wing behind the laundry area, next to the janitor's closet. Leonard had helped repair it months earlier, tightening a few fittings when the system leaked during the winter. It worked fine after that, though no licensed technician ever inspected his work. Sophie sometimes joked that the motel held together mostly out of luck. On the night of February 9th, the temperature had dropped into the mid-30s. Sophie stayed up late finishing the night audit, a routine check of cash receipts and online bookings, while the janitor mopped the hallway. Around 11 p.m., 2 guests were outside smoking near the parking lot, facing the utility wing. They later told investigators they heard a sharp hiss, followed by a heavy metallic thump. Seconds later, the steel door to the boiler room bulged outward and blew off its hinges. The explosion sent scalding steam and hot water flooding into the narrow hallway. One of the smokers, a man from room 7, ran toward the building when he heard shouting. Through the steam, he saw Sophie trying to reach the front door. He pulled her partway into the lobby, but she collapsed before they made it outside. The janitor escaped through the laundry exit with minor burns. The witnesses called 911 as alarms in the office, and nearby rooms began to beep from the sudden heat. Firefighters arrived within minutes, shutting down the remaining gas lines and ventilating the wing. The boiler tank had ruptured near its base, splitting along a welded seam. Investigators later found that the safety relief valve, designed to vent excess pressure, had been tightened fully shut. Threads on the valve showed tool marks that matched a wrench, suggesting deliberate tampering. Records confirmed that Leonard Price was the last person to perform any repairs on that boiler before his eviction. The damage to the building was extensive. Ceiling panels in the hallway had peeled from the heat, and sections of the wall framing were warped from the pressure wave. Sophie was taken to a Reno hospital but died shortly after arrival from severe burns and inhalation injuries. The janitor told police he had seen Leonard's truck parked near the service road less than an hour before the blast. Detectives located Leonard 3 days later at a relative's property near Carson City. He was arrested without incident after neighbors reported a pickup matching the motel's surveillance photo parked in the driveway. Investigators recovered burned work clothes and a set of tools consistent with those used on the boiler. During questioning, Leonard denied involvement, but could not explain why the safety valve showed fresh wrench marks matching his equipment. He was later charged with second-degree murder and arson resulting in death. The trial concluded the following year, and he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The motel closed temporarily after the incident. Renovations began that summer under new management, replacing the entire heating system with modern units. When the building reopened the next year, the room numbers had been changed. Units 12 through 15, where the hallway damage had been worst, were removed from the layout entirely. Guests who stayed later said they never noticed anything unusual, except that the numbering skipped from 11 straight to 16. It was May 2015 in a quiet Utah suburb, where houses lined a narrow cul-de-sac. The Whitakers lived on one side, the Clarks on the other. The driveways met in the center, separated only by a strip of shared concrete poured years before either family moved in. For months, small arguments about parking and boundaries had built into daily tension. 41-year-old John Whitaker worked construction and often parked his pickup close to the line. Across from him, Tom and Melissa Clark owned a large SUV that barely fit in their drive. Neighbors later said the problem started when Tom accidentally grazed John's truck while backing out. The scratch was small, but John treated it as deliberate. The two men argued in the street while Melissa tried to calm them down. After that day, the families barely spoke. John installed a small camera facing his driveway, and the Clarks put up a motion light. Every time one vehicle idled too long near the dividing strip, the other household took notice. On the evening of June 12th, witnesses saw John outside near dusk, pacing along the driveway and muttering about teaching the neighbors a lesson. Around 9 p.m., he carried out a 5-gallon jug of motor oil and poured it in a thin layer across the center section of concrete where the two driveways met. He later told investigators he only wanted to make the surface slippery so the Clarks would stop parking close to his truck. A light rain began just after 10 p.m., coating the neighborhood in a thin mist. The mixture of oil and water created a slick sheen that ran several feet down the incline toward the street. Around 10:40, Melissa returned from her late shift at the grocery store. Security footage from a nearby house showed her SUV's headlights turning into the cul-de-sac and backing toward the driveway. As she reversed up the incline, the tires hit the oiled patch and lost traction. The vehicle rolled backward faster than she could correct. Across the street, a neighbor on his porch saw the tail lights jerk upward as the rear end struck the retaining wall at the edge of the yard. He heard glass break, followed by a dull thud. John ran out of his house seconds later, shouting her name. He tried to open the driver's side door but slipped on the wet pavement. When police and paramedics arrived, they found the rear of the SUV crushed against the concrete lip. Melissa was still inside, unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at the scene from blunt force injuries. Investigators noticed the heavy oil residue that still floated on the puddles along the driveway. They collected samples and later matched them to the same brand stored in John's garage. His fingerprints were found on the plastic jug left behind near the trash bin. During questioning, John first claimed he spilled the oil accidentally, then admitted to pouring it intentionally, but insisted he didn't expect anyone to get hurt. The county prosecutor charged him with criminally negligent homicide and reckless endangerment. The case drew attention locally because of its simplicity, an ordinary neighborhood dispute that escalated without warning. He was found competent to stand trial after a brief evaluation and accepted a plea agreement rather than face a full jury trial. John pleaded guilty the following year and received a 10-year sentence. The house went up for sale soon after John's conviction. Tom Clark moved out of the neighborhood within months, saying he couldn't stand seeing the spot where the crash happened. New owners later repaved the entire driveway, covering the shared strip with fresh concrete. Longtime residents still point out the faint discoloration near the edge where oil once stained the surface, a small mark left from a grudge that turned fatal. It was July 2015, in the foothills near Hinton, Alberta, where a summer adventure camp trained teenagers in survival skills and wilderness navigation. One of the camp's ridgeside trails wound through a forested slope bordered by dense spruce and shallow creeks. 28-year-old Mark Tiller had worked there for 5 years as a wilderness instructor, known for his quiet personality and skill with backcountry maintenance. That season, his co-worker Rachel Keene, 27, led most of the morning hikes and safety briefings. The two had briefly dated the year before but broke things off when Rachel began seeing another guide. Co-workers later said Mark became distant after that. He volunteered for night patrols and took on most of the solo trail work, clearing branches or checking sensor lines that detected animal movement near camp. Some instructors remembered him joking that certain trails should just be left to the wildlife or that a bit of noise might scare off the morning groups. Nobody took it seriously. Mark had a dry sense of humor, and long work days often ended with idle talk about bears and coyotes around the fire. By early July, camp attendance had peaked. On July 16th, the staff planned a short pre-breakfast hike for a small group of campers. Rachel led the front, followed by 2 counselors and 6 teens. The air was cool, the ground damp from overnight rain, and visibility was limited under thick tree cover. The group started along the East Ridge Trail at about 6:45 a.m. The plan was to circle toward the storage hut, where equipment for outdoor cooking was kept. As the group neared the hut, a faint beeping noise broke the morning quiet. One counselor thought it was a motion alarm. Small devices were attached to trees to track movement for wildlife studies. Before anyone could check, a deep growl echoed from behind the storage shed. A black bear, estimated at around 250 pounds, stepped out from the brush. Witnesses later said it moved toward a rope hanging near the shed, where chunks of raw meat were tied in a mesh bag. The smell had carried downwind toward the trail. Rachel told the campers to stay still and began backing away slowly. Behind her, the ground sloped downward, scattered with roots and wet leaves. She tripped and fell backward just as the bear turned toward the movement. Mark had been assigned to that section earlier in the week and was about 50 yards away on a side trail, clearing debris near the motion sensors. He froze, watching as the bear charged forward. The 2 counselors shouted and fired handheld flares from their belts, sending bright sparks across the clearing. The bear struck once with its paw, then retreated into the trees when the second flare ignited. Campers and staff carried Rachel back toward the main trail and radioed for help. Emergency crews arrived by helicopter within the hour, but she was pronounced dead at the scene from neck and chest injuries. Wildlife officers determined the bear had been drawn deliberately to the area. The bag of meat had been tied at shoulder height to one of the sensor lines, which were part of Mark's maintenance route. Investigators found his boot tracks near the shed and a half-empty plastic feed bucket behind a locked supply crate with traces of blood and fat residue inside. Wildlife officers later tracked and euthanized the bear 2 days after the attack, following standard protocol for fatal incidents. When questioned, Mark admitted to placing the meat but claimed it was meant for a training demonstration, not to attract an active bear. The camp's management disputed that explanation, saying no such activity was scheduled that morning. He was charged with criminal negligence causing death and violating wildlife protection laws. The Ridgeside Trail was shut down permanently after the incident. The storage hut was dismantled the following season, and the area was fenced off to prevent access. The old wooden warning sign still stands at the tree line, its yellow letters faded by weather, marking where the trail once began. It was July 2018 in Clearwater, Florida, when the city pool opened for its busiest week of summer. Temperatures stayed near 90, and the water was crowded from morning until dusk. Two of the seasonal lifeguards, 23-year-old Ryan Geller and 22-year-old Derek Mills, had worked together since May. Both were certified instructors, quick swimmers, and known for pushing each other during training. The competition started harmlessly. Who could climb the ladder faster, who cleared the diving boards first, but soon turned personal. Supervisors noticed they timed every drill down to the second. During a mid-July rescue simulation, Ryan outperformed Derek by almost 4 seconds. The staff clapped, and one of the senior guards joked that Derek should stick to sunscreen duty. Witnesses later said Derek laughed it off, but his mood changed afterward. He started showing up early and staying late, cleaning gear and checking equipment on his own. Small arguments broke out between the two about whose rotation zone was more difficult. The final staff evaluation was set for July 21st. The city planned to promote one seasonal lifeguard to full-time for the fall swim programs. Derek knew the decision would come down to their performance in the timed rescue test. That evening, after closing, he lingered near the diving area. Surveillance later showed him kneeling beside the lifeguard lane with a bottle of oil-based sunscreen, rubbing some onto his arms, then spreading the rest across the wet deck near the rescue line. He wiped it once with a towel, leaving a slick, nearly invisible layer that blended with the water already on the tiles. The next morning, the staff gathered for drills before the pool opened. The deck was humid and slippery as usual from the early cleaning cycle. Ryan stood at his station near the deep end, waiting for the whistle that signaled the start of his timed run. Derek took the next lane over, watching. At 7:40 a.m., the supervisor blew the whistle and called a mock rescue from the diving area. Ryan sprinted forward, as he always did, crossing the same stretch of deck he used in every practice. Halfway across, his right foot slid sideways. Witnesses said his arms flailed once before he fell backward, striking the pool edge behind him. The sound echoed across the water, followed by the splash of his body sliding into the deep end. 2 guards dove in immediately, pulling him to the surface within seconds. He was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but he was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital from a severe head injury. Investigators found traces of sunscreen mixed with pool water on the deck, and later recovered the nearly empty bottle from the trash bin behind the lifeguard stand. Derek's fingerprints were identified on the cap. During questioning, he admitted spreading it as a prank and said he only wanted to make the deck extra slippery for a laugh. He was charged with manslaughter and reckless endangerment. The pool reopened weeks later with new safety flooring and a permanent sign warning staff to keep the deck dry at all times. It was November 18, 2016 in Manchester, England. A damp, cold night settled over the city, the streets slick with recent rain. Inside a quiet duplex complex, a personal betrayal was about to turn lethal, not through accident but through deliberate rage. Clara Winslow, 28, worked as a freelance graphic designer from her apartment, producing digital content for regional clients and occasional European brands. Just a week earlier, she had ended a 2-year relationship with Ronan Blackwood after he discovered she had been seeing someone else. Friends later described the breakup as volatile. They cited one confrontation outside her building that ended with police being called but no charges filed. Her apartment was modestly furnished, with equipment and electronics positioned around the living space, including a workstation in the corner and a mattress by the window for natural light. She often stayed up late completing design work, leaving windows slightly ajar for ventilation and to let in the city's ambient light. She had refused to install additional security measures beyond basic locks, believing situational awareness was sufficient. While technically mindful of risk, she underestimated human threats in her immediate environment. That night, Ronan returned to the complex. Neighbors had reported him loitering in previous evenings after arguments regarding shared property and personal items. Carrying a bottle of gasoline, he approached Clara's ground floor window, partially ajar for ventilation. A neighbor's private security camera captured a crouching figure at the window frame. The liquid container visible in hand, scene reconstruction reports detailed that Clara, unaware of the approaching danger, was likely completing work at her computer, headphones in, leaving her oblivious to external sounds. Ronan poured the gasoline across the mattress and nearby bedding, then ignited it with a lighter. Flames spread almost instantly across the synthetic fibers due to vapors in the confined space, rapidly climbing toward the window frame and nearby furniture. Smoke began filling the room almost immediately. Although some smoke escaped through the slightly open window, the ceiling height and clutter allowed dense smoke to accumulate near the floor, disorienting Clara. Evidence showed that Clara attempted to exit her bedroom, but shadows and smoke made doors and obstacles difficult to discern, complicating her escape. Neighbors heard persistent coughing and pounding on her bedroom door, but were unable to break it down before the fire's intensity caused localized ceiling plaster and timber above the mattress to collapse, further blocking potential egress. Firefighters arrived within 6 minutes of the alarm, but initial entry was slowed by heat and debris, forcing entry to find Clara unresponsive amid thick smoke and intense heat. She still had a faint pulse when pulled from the room, and was immediately transferred by ambulance to Manchester Royal Infirmary, where she was treated for severe smoke inhalation and burns. Despite resuscitation efforts, she was declared dead less than 2 hours later. Post-incident analysis confirmed the fire had originated on the mattress near the window, accelerated by liquid fuel, with rapid thermal propagation consistent with an accelerant. Evidence from neighbor cameras and fire debris corroborated the timeline and sequence of events, confirming no accidental cause. Coroner's report listed cause of death as mixed smoke inhalation and thermal burns, noting extensive soot in the airway and lungs and burns consistent with rapid room fire. Ronan Blackwood was arrested the following day, after footage and witness statements were cross-referenced. Manchester City Council fire inspectors required a formal assessment before repairs could proceed, and the complex implemented additional safety measures, including updated smoke alarms and door security. It was March 14, 2017 in Toronto, Canada. The mid-afternoon sun filtered weakly through the high windows of North Bay Fitness. The gym hummed with the usual clatter of plates and murmurs of conversation, but the result of personal grudges was about to escalate horribly. Marcus Hilliard, 32, worked as a personal trainer and competed in amateur powerlifting circuits across Ontario. He was disciplined and highly focused in his training, but had a confrontational streak, particularly with former peers who challenged his reputation. Outside the gym, Marcus trained clients in strict schedules and maintained meticulous records of lifts, nutrition, and recovery. Friends noted that he reacted aggressively to criticism. He prided himself on resilience, rarely stepping aside in disputes, and had recently clashed with a former training partner, Corbin Lefroy, over competition results, with their rivalry simmering privately and publicly for weeks. That afternoon, Corbin arrived at North Bay Fitness during peak hours. Marcus was overseeing a client near the free weight section when verbal provocation began. Over 10 minutes, witnesses saw and heard escalating insults and threats, the atmosphere growing tense as other gym-goers paused their routines. Security cameras captured the exchange, showing both men gesturing angrily and stepping closer with each rebuttal. Despite staff attempts to intervene verbally, the confrontation intensified. The gym was crowded, and the space near the barbells was narrow, with minimally cushioned flooring around the lifting area, creating a slip hazard. Marcus's posture shifted defensively, his focus divided between his client and the aggression of Corbin. His previous experience in high-pressure competition gave him confidence, but it also contributed to underestimating the immediate physical risk. Suddenly, Corbin lifted a barbell loaded with plates totaling approximately 110 pounds from the rack and swung it in a controlled but powerful arc toward Marcus's head. Witnesses described the motion as swift and deliberate. Marcus staggered back, attempting to shield himself, but his feet slipped on the worn floor mat, and he fell. The barbell connected with the side of his skull, driving him to the ground where he struck the hard gym floor with full force. The impact caused immediate loss of consciousness. For several seconds, Corbin just stood there, likely due to shock, before dropping the bar and sitting against the nearest wall, appearing dazed rather than enraged. Bystanders and gym staff rushed to assist, applying first aid and beginning CPR within 2 minutes of collapse, while emergency medical services were contacted. The CCTV footage showed Marcus lying motionless, limbs splayed, with rapid but ineffective compressions applied by staff. Within minutes, paramedics arrived and assessed massive cranial trauma, including a depressed skull fracture and extensive cerebral hemorrhage, making resuscitation impossible despite immediate intervention. Post-mortem examination confirmed blunt force trauma to the cranium, with a depressed skull fracture and subdural hematoma. The detailed analysis indicated that the impact location and force from the barbell, combined with the secondary floor impact, rendered survival impossible, even with rapid medical response. When another member shouted that police had arrived, Corbin made no attempt to flee and remained seated. Police reviewed the gym's security footage and arrested Corbin Lefroy immediately. In court, Corbin pleaded guilty to manslaughter, claiming the assault followed weeks of escalating tension over alleged harassment and verbal provocation. Psychological evaluations described him as remorseful, with no prior record of violence. He was sentenced to 8 years in a medium-security correctional facility in Ontario, eligible for parole after 5. It was May 22, 2017, in Leipzig, Germany. A dormant threat born of malice. Staff moving between stations were unaware that the hydraulic press, one of the largest on the line, had been compromised. Klaus Brenner, 45, had worked as a press operator for over 2 decades, respected for his precision and reliability. He managed heavy machinery with years of accumulated skill, understanding the timing, pressures, and load tolerances of each hydraulic system. Klaus was known among colleagues for his methodical nature and quiet professionalism. Outside of work, he volunteered with a local technical school, mentoring apprentices in industrial safety and metalworking techniques. Despite his caution, Klaus often relied on routine and habit, assuming that standard safety interlocks and emergency stops were fully functional. Klaus's responsibilities included feeding large metal sheets into presses capable of exerting hundreds of tons of force, operating controls from a short distance while monitoring alignment, and coordinating with line assistants to maintain workflow. The machinery required precise calibration and awareness of potential hazards like misfeeds, hydraulic leaks, and unexpected system cycles. He wore all standard protective gear, steel-toed boots, gloves, and a reinforced apron. But his confidence in the equipment's safety systems created a blind spot, particularly toward human interference. CCTV footage showed that in the morning of May 22, 2017, a former supervisor, recently terminated in January, had returned with clear intent to sabotage, slipping through the busy factory floor wearing his work uniform. The safety interlock on the primary hydraulic press had been deliberately bypassed by tampering with the control circuitry, leaving the machine capable of cycling even when guards were open. Co-workers noticed a faint difference in the press's operational hum, but dismissed it as routine maintenance noise. Klaus began his shift, lining up a stack of metal sheets, unaware of the tampering. The factory floor was busier than usual due to a large order, adding mild distraction and pressure to maintain efficiency. As Klaus lifted the first sheet into position, he followed his standard procedure, checking alignment and applying gradual pressure through the controls. A sudden mechanical jolt occurred as the press cycled unexpectedly due to the sabotaged interlock. Colleagues on either side froze as the machine descended. Witnesses described a sharp impact noise audible across the immediate section of the factory, startling nearby workers. Klaus was unable to withdraw. The emergency stop and manual override had been disabled by the sabotage, preventing any intervention. The press's ram struck Klaus's torso, compressing his chest and abdomen in an instant. The floor became chaotic, with alarms blaring and workers shouting for emergency assistance. Factory cameras captured the motionless form beneath the ram, and the frantic attempts of co-workers, providing a clear record of the rapid, fatal sequence. Emergency medical services were contacted, arriving within 10 minutes. Autopsy later confirmed multiple crush injuries to thorax and abdomen, with cause of death listed as blunt force trauma due to industrial press. The manner of death was determined to be homicide. Investigators reviewed footage, maintenance logs, and fingerprints, ultimately tracing the tampering to the former supervisor. The individual's actions constituted serious criminal offenses under German law. Following the incident, authorities issued a national wanted notice and coordinated with Interpol, as evidence suggested the suspect had left Germany within days. Factory management immediately replaced safety interlocks on all presses and retrained operators on emergency procedures. The press line resumed work only after structural and procedural inspections ensured full compliance with safety protocols. Despite the identification of the suspect, authorities have not located him. It was April 9, 2015 in Miami, Florida. The morning air was warm and humid, carrying the faint scent of salt from Biscayne Bay. Along a narrow alley behind a small commercial strip, a quiet tension had settled. Samantha Rowley, 39, owned a boutique specializing in artisanal jewelry and high-end accessories. She had built the business from scratch over the past decade, gaining a modest local reputation for her keen eye and uncompromising standards. Professionally, Samantha was confident and assertive, qualities that earned her respect, but sometimes animosity. She had recently been involved in a legal dispute with Andre Marin, a local businessman, where her public testimony had embarrassed him, with social pressures and minor local fame amplifying the tension. Her daily routine involved opening the boutique early, cataloging inventory, and arranging displays. She knew her environment well, the layout of the store, the back alley, and the reinforced access points, but she underestimated the determination of someone motivated by revenge. Her security system included cameras and motion detectors, yet she often relied on visual checks herself, rather than waiting for alarm verification. This complacency, coupled with a predictable schedule, left her exposed. On the morning of April 9th, an intruder hired to exact revenge and disguise the murder as a burglary approached the back entrance. Samantha was inside preparing for the day's first deliveries. Surveillance cameras recorded a masked figure prying at the door, struggling to lift the latch. The intruder gained entry, stepping carefully but purposefully into the storage area. Samantha, hearing the noise, moved toward the back room, unaware that she was confronting a calculated threat rather than a petty thief. She attempted to block the intruder, gesturing and speaking, but the figure struck her immediately with a blunt instrument. Neighbors later reported hearing screams that cut sharply through the morning calm. Witnesses outside the alley saw movement and the figure retreating, dragging Samantha briefly toward the back office. Items from her desk and counters were strewn across the floor, staged to mimic a robbery, but mistakenly left valuables untouched. The intruder's exit was hurried, leaving behind scattered papers and an overturned chair, but surveillance clearly captured the masked figure's deliberate actions. Emergency services arrived within 7 minutes of neighbor calls. Samantha was found unresponsive on the floor, the scene showing repeated blunt force trauma to the head. Her body displayed multiple skull fractures, hemorrhaging, brain contusions, and lacerations, as well as defensive wounds on her forearms and hands. Consistent with high-impact strikes, blood pooling and body position indicated rapid incapacitation. Forensic examination confirmed blunt force trauma to the head with skull fractures, hemorrhage, and brain laceration. Manner of death classified as homicide. Police investigation used CCTV footage and fingerprints matched through the local database, quickly identifying the hired intruder within 3 days. The hitman admitted in court that he assaulted Samantha under Andre Marin's instructions and was sentenced to 20 years for second-degree murder and conspiracy. Consistent with Florida sentencing guidelines, Andre Marin was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy, receiving a 35-year prison sentence. While both men initially showed little remorse, The hitman later spoke privately about regretting the violence and its irreversible consequences. It was July 11, 2016, in Melbourne, Australia. The morning was clear, with sunlight glinting off wet streets from an overnight drizzle. Traffic flowed steadily. Cyclists wove between commuters, and on the corner of a busy intersection, a simmering argument was about to erupt into a deadly confrontation. Elliot Granger, 29, worked as a software developer at a mid-sized tech firm. He spent weekdays immersed in coding and debugging, often solving complex problems under tight deadlines outside work. Elliot was an avid cyclist, using weekends to train and explore city streets for fitness and recreation. However, he had previously reported repeated confrontations with a neighbor over parking disputes, including threats and aggressive gestures. Elliot's cycling gear was standard for urban riders: high-visibility jersey, helmet, and reflective strips on his bike. He trusted these precautions and his knowledge of local traffic patterns to keep him safe. The neighborhood had moderate traffic, crosswalks, and signals, but intersections could be chaotic during morning hours. Surveillance footage later confirmed the neighbor's vehicle, a black SUV driven by Darius Kincaid, had been involved in multiple aggressive maneuvers near the apartment driveway and intersection in the weeks prior, signaling a potential threat. That morning, Elliot cycled to a local cafe, taking a familiar route past the disputed apartment complex. Darius was observed leaving the property in the black SUV, engine running aggressively, glancing toward the street where Elliot would cross. Despite prior warnings from police about escalating hostility, Elliot continued his route, assuming the conflict would not escalate to physical harm. Pedestrians and nearby cafe patrons noted tension in the street, but few anticipated violence. As Elliot approached the intersection, the SUV accelerated. Witnesses described the vehicle veering slightly to strike the cyclist directly at approximately 25 miles per hour. Elliot attempted to brake and swerve, but the impact threw him several meters across the asphalt. He was first struck by the front bumper, then secondary impact with the pavement and curb, his bike crumpling beneath him. He suffered direct trauma to the torso and abdomen. Bystanders called emergency services immediately, some trying to provide first aid. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Elliot was unconscious, pale, and bleeding internally, with labored, shallow breathing. Assessment indicated massive abdominal trauma, including lacerations to the liver and spleen, hypotension, and tachycardia, consistent with hemorrhagic shock. Despite rapid intervention and attempts at stabilization, vital signs deteriorated. Witness footage from nearby shops captured the SUV fleeing the scene moments after impact, tires squealing, leaving only shocked pedestrians behind. Forensic examination later confirmed that Elliot died from blunt force trauma to the torso, which caused lacerations to the liver and spleen, resulting in hemorrhagic shock. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. Investigators analyzed vehicle deformation, skid marks, paint transfer, and surveillance footage, along with witness statements, to conclusively link the SUV to Darius Kincaid. He was subsequently arrested and charged with manslaughter, pending further assessment of intent under Australian law. It was October 22, 2014, in Lyon, France. The evening air was cool and crisp, with the streets quiet as autumn shadows lengthened. In a well-appointed apartment in the Croix-Rousse district, a convivial dinner was underway, but behind the polished silverware and carefully arranged candles, something was about to transform hospitality into tragedy. Isabelle Chevalier, 52, owned a small but respected bistro in central Lyon, known for her curated wine selection and seasonal menus. She had spent decades cultivating her reputation as both chef and sommelier, often attending regional tastings and representing local producers at culinary events. She prided herself on her knowledge of French gastronomy and hosting elegant dinners that doubled as networking opportunities for restaurateurs and wine merchants. Isabelle's professional experience extended to handling ingredients safely, understanding toxicological risks, and overseeing kitchen operations with precision. While confident in her culinary skills, Isabelle could not anticipate malicious intent from a guest who had a prior unresolved dispute with her over a wine shipment contract. That night, Isabelle prepared a shared dessert for the guests, unaware that one attendee had secretly introduced awabine, a potent cardiotoxic glycoside, into the dish. The gathering included acquaintances from the culinary community, each engaged in light conversation, sampling wine, and enjoying the meticulously prepared meal. Isabel consumed the dessert with enthusiasm, commenting on the texture and balance, a routine she'd performed countless times during tasting. Small signs, the slight bitterness at the edges of the dessert, went unremarked, masked by the dark chocolate ganache. The dessert had been carefully portioned to ensure only Isabel ingested a lethal dose. Within 45 minutes, Isabel started having severe stomach cramps, dizziness, blurry vision, and her heart rate slowed dangerously. Guests immediately noticed her pallor and unsteady movements, attempting to guide her to a chair. Despite first aid efforts, her condition deteriorated rapidly. Calls were made to emergency services and paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, finding her semi-conscious and in extreme distress. Heart rate was erratic, blood pressure collapsed, and neurological function impaired, consistent with potent cardiotoxic exposure. ECG monitoring showed severe arrhythmia, and paramedics initiated advanced life support measures, including oxygen, IV access, and cardiac monitoring. Guests attempted assisted respiration and monitored vitals as emergency responders transported her to the hospital. During the drive, Isabel's condition worsened. She lost consciousness en route, and resuscitation attempts at the hospital failed. Witnesses reported her skin turning pale and cyanotic, pupils dilated, and absence of coordinated breathing. Footage from private security cameras confirmed she had ingested the dessert in its entirety, with no other obvious contributing factors present in the apartment. Medical staff confirmed that the awabane fatally disrupted cardiac rhythm and neurological function. Post-mortem examination determined acute awabane poisoning, a highly cardiotoxic glycoside, caused systemic cardiovascular failure, with toxicology measuring lethal levels in blood, stomach contents, and liver tissue. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. Police collected remaining food samples and interviewed attendees, resulting in a confession from the responsible individual. Within a week, French authorities arrested Julien Marchand, the guest responsible, and he was charged with premeditated murder. He was convicted and sentenced to 25 years imprisonment, with additional fines and a prohibition from working in food service. An accomplice who aided in concealing the poison received a shorter sentence of 10 years. It was March 15, 2016, when a heated workplace confrontation in a major Midwest city turned deadly, forever changing the lives of two men whose bitter rivalry had been building for months. Clint Harrison, a 34-year-old warehouse supervisor at a mid-sized industrial supply company, was known throughout the facility for his aggressive management style and cruel tendency to publicly humiliate his workers. Standing at 6 feet tall with a commanding presence, Clint ruled his domain with an iron fist, believing that fear and intimidation were the keys to productivity. Martin Webb, 28, operated forklifts on the day shift and had become Clint's primary target over the past 6 months. Webb was a quiet, hard-working family man whose wife was expecting their second child. Despite his stellar safety record spanning 5 years without incident, Clint had systematically written him up for minor infractions, creating a paper trail designed to justify denying Webb a recent promotion to lead operator. Webb's co-workers had witnessed Clint's campaign of harassment, but none dared speak up for fear of becoming targets themselves. The warehouse culture had become toxic under Clint's leadership, with employees walking on eggshells and productivity suffering despite his intimidation tactics. The tension reached a breaking point that Monday afternoon during shift change. Clint had spent the day berating Webb in front of the entire crew, calling him incompetent and threatening termination over a minor paperwork error. As Webb prepared to clock out, Clint cornered him near the loading dock, away from most witnesses. Clint's voice echoed through the empty loading area as he continued his verbal assault, telling Webb he would never amount to anything and that his family would suffer because of his incompetence. He mocked Webb's financial struggles and suggested that maybe his wife would be better off with a real man. When Webb tried to walk away, Clint grabbed his arm and shoved him backward with unnecessary force. In a moment of rage fueled by months of humiliation, Webb grabbed a 3-pound steel pipe wrench from a nearby maintenance cart. Without thinking, driven by pure instinct and overwhelming anger, he swung it at Clint's head with full force. The wrench struck Clint's left temple with a sickening crack, fracturing his skull and causing immediate brain trauma. Clint collapsed instantly, his body hitting the concrete floor with a dull thud as blood began pooling beneath his head. He convulsed briefly, his eyes rolling back before going completely still. The impact had caused a massive subdural hematoma, and Clint died within 2 minutes from severe brain injury and internal bleeding. Webb stood frozen in shock, the wrench still in his trembling hands as he realized what he had done. 2 other employees working nearby had witnessed the entire confrontation and came running when they heard the impact. One immediately called 911, while the other tried unsuccessfully to provide first aid. Webb was arrested and charged with voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, as prosecutors acknowledged the confrontation was not premeditated. During the trial, testimony revealed Clint's systematic pattern of workplace harassment and the mounting financial pressure Webb faced supporting his growing family. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison, citing the tragic circumstances, but noting that violence could never be justified. It was October 14, 2018, when 3 years of neighborhood harassment reached its deadly conclusion on a quiet Sunday afternoon, as what began as a property dispute between neighbors escalated into unthinkable violence that would shatter 2 families forever. Sarah Mitchell, 34, was a devoted mother of 2 young children who had endured relentless bullying from her next-door neighbor, Tessa Monroe, 41. What started as complaints about Sarah's children playing too loudly had evolved into a systematic campaign of psychological warfare that included false police reports, deliberate property damage, and increasingly threatening behavior towards Sarah's family. Tessa, a bitter divorcee who worked nights as a security guard, seemed to take perverse pleasure in tormenting the Mitchell family. Her own life had fallen apart after a messy divorce that left her financially struggling and emotionally unstable. She had called Child Protective Services multiple times with fabricated abuse allegations, forcing Sarah to endure humiliating investigations that found no evidence of wrongdoing. The harassment escalated when Tessa began targeting the family pets. She had poisoned their beloved golden retriever, Max, with antifreeze, claiming the dog was too noisy when it barked at strangers. The veterinary bills had cost the Mitchells over $3,000, and Max barely survived the poisoning. That Sunday afternoon, Sarah was tending to her vegetable garden while her 6-year-old daughter Emma played on the swing set. The October air was crisp and peaceful, with colorful leaves scattered across the yard. Tessa emerged from her house in a rage, still wearing her security guard uniform from the previous night's shift. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep and alcohol consumption. She began screaming at Emma, claiming the child's laughter was disturbing her sleep and threatening to call the police if the noise didn't stop immediately. When Sarah intervened, rushing to protect her daughter, Tessa escalated the confrontation by threatening to make the whole family disappear and claiming she had connections who could take care of problems like them. The threat was delivered with such venom that Sarah genuinely feared for her family's safety. Emma began crying and ran to hide behind her mother, trembling with fear. The argument moved to the front yard where other neighbors began watching from their windows, some recording the confrontation on their phones. Tessa, emboldened by the audience, grabbed Sarah's garden hose and began spraying both Sarah and Emma with freezing water, soaking their clothes and causing Emma to scream in shock and cold. Sarah, overwhelmed by 3 years of torment and seeing her daughter being physically assaulted, pushed Tessa away from them with both hands. The force was not excessive, but Tessa, who had been drinking and was unsteady on her feet, stumbled backward and fell, striking her head on the sharp concrete edge of her driveway with a sickening crack. The impact caused a severe concussion and immediate brain swelling. Tessa lost consciousness instantly and began having violent seizures, her body convulsing uncontrollably as blood seeped from her head wound onto the concrete. Sarah, overwhelmed by 3 years of psychological torture and seeing her traumatized daughter, made a split-second decision that would haunt her forever. Instead of immediately calling 911, she took Emma inside their house and waited 15 crucial minutes before calling emergency services, claiming she had just discovered her neighbor unconscious after an apparent fall. Tessa died from her brain injuries before paramedics could save her. The delayed emergency response proved critical. Medical experts later testified that immediate treatment could have prevented her death, as the brain swelling could have been controlled with rapid intervention. It was November 18th, 2017, when the prestigious university dormitory became the scene of a calculated murder, as academic rivalry and social jealousy drove one student to commit what she believed would be the perfect crime. Bryce Chandler, 19, was a pre-med student whose perfect GPA and effortless social success had made him the target of his roommates' growing resentment and obsessive hatred. Bryce came from a wealthy family in California, maintained straight A's without apparent effort, and was dating the most popular girl on campus. Amanda Torres, 20, was a scholarship student from a working-class family who worked 2 part-time jobs to afford basic necessities like food and textbooks. Despite studying constantly, often until 3 a.m. in the library, she struggled to maintain a B average while watching Bryce excel without breaking a sweat. Amanda's financial stress was overwhelming. She survived on ramen noodles and generic coffee while Bryce ordered expensive takeout. The contrast between their lives was stark and painful. While Amanda wore the same 3 outfits repeatedly and walked everywhere to save money, Bryce had a closet full of designer clothes and complained about having to choose between his Mercedes and BMW for weekend trips home. Amanda discovered that Bryce had a severe peanut allergy that he kept secret from most people, fearing it would affect his social life and dating prospects. Bryce carried an EpiPen in his backpack but rarely mentioned his condition, trusting Amanda with this potentially life-threatening secret. Over several weeks, Amanda researched peanut allergies extensively, learning that even trace amounts could trigger severe reactions in highly sensitive individuals. She began tampering with small amounts of peanut residue in his food and personal items, observing how he reacted without drawing attention. Amanda contaminated Bryce's lip balm, face cream, and even his pillowcase with tiny amounts of peanut residue, causing him to develop mysterious rashes and breathing difficulties that he attributed to stress and poor air quality in the dorm. The plan culminated during finals week, when stress levels were at their highest and Bryce was most vulnerable. Amanda prepared Bryce's favorite protein smoothie using a blender she had deliberately contaminated with peanut butter hours earlier, ensuring maximum cross-contamination. Bryce, touched by what seemed like a rare gesture of kindness from his distant roommate, consumed the entire smoothie while reviewing his notes at his desk. Within minutes, he began experiencing the first symptoms: tingling in his mouth and throat, followed by difficulty swallowing. The allergic reaction progressed rapidly. Bryce's face began swelling, his breathing became labored and wheezy, and his blood pressure started dropping dangerously. He recognized the symptoms immediately and searched frantically for his EpiPen, which Amanda had hidden earlier in the day while Bryce was in class. Amanda watched with cold calculation as Bryce collapsed on the floor, gasping for air and begging Amanda to call 911. Bryce's lips were turning blue, and his swollen throat was making breathing nearly impossible. His eyes were wide with terror as he realized what was happening and that his roommate was making no move to help him. Instead of helping, Amanda sat at her desk and continued studying for her own exam, occasionally glancing at Bryce's deteriorating condition with detached interest. She waited until Bryce stopped breathing entirely before calling emergency services, claiming she had just discovered her roommate unconscious. Bryce died from anaphylactic shock, his body shutting down from the severe allergic reaction. The investigation initially treated it as a tragic accident, until Amanda's internet search history revealed extensive research into peanut allergies, cross-contamination methods, and deliberate poisoning techniques. It was December 25, 2018, when Christmas dinner became a scene of horror, as decades of family resentment and financial manipulation exploded into violence that would destroy an entire bloodline and shatter the illusion of a perfect family. Lana Whitfield, 67, was the wealthy matriarch of a prominent family who had spent years manipulating her children through financial control and emotional abuse. Her late husband had built a successful real estate empire worth over $15 million, and Lana had used this wealth as a weapon to control every aspect of her children's lives. David Whitmore, 42, was Lana's youngest son who had sacrificed his promising career as an architect to serve as her primary caregiver for the past 5 years. He had moved into her mansion, given up his own apartment, and dedicated his life to managing her medical appointments, medications, and daily needs. Despite his devotion, Lana constantly criticized him and threatened to remove him from her will entirely whenever he showed any sign of independence. Lana's manipulation was psychological and systematic. She would promise David inheritance money to keep him dependent, then threaten to disinherit him whenever he considered dating or pursuing his own interests. The family had gathered for their traditional Christmas dinner at Lana's sprawling estate, a ritual that had become increasingly tense over the years. The dining room was elegantly decorated with expensive china and crystal, creating an atmosphere of wealth and tradition that masked the underlying dysfunction. During the meal, Lana announced she was changing her will again, this time leaving everything to a cancer research charity and disinheriting all her children completely. She claimed they were all ungrateful parasites who didn't deserve her wealth, and that she wanted to leave a meaningful legacy rather than support their lazy lifestyles. David, who had given up everything to care for his mother and had no savings or career prospects at age 42, felt his world collapsing. The other siblings had their own careers and families, but David had nothing except his role as caregiver. The argument that followed was explosive, with years of suppressed resentment finally erupting. Lana began listing David's failures and inadequacies in front of the entire family, calling him a disappointment and claiming he had never accomplished anything worthwhile. She mocked his abandoned architectural career and suggested he was too weak and pathetic to survive on his own. When David tried to defend himself, explaining the sacrifices he had made for her care, Lana slapped him hard across the face in front of his nieces and nephews. The slap was not just physical but symbolic, a final rejection of everything he had given up for her. In a moment of pure rage and desperation, David grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the dining room table, an expensive piece that had been in the family for generations. He struck his mother across the head with tremendous force, the crystal shattering on impact and causing severe head trauma. Lana collapsed onto the dining room floor and never regained consciousness. Blood was pooling beneath her gray hair and mixing with the scattered crystal fragments. The elegant Christmas dinner had become a crime scene, with children screaming and adults frozen in shock. David's siblings immediately called 911, and paramedics arrived within minutes. Despite resuscitation attempts, Lana was unresponsive, and her injuries were later determined to be fatal. It was September 22, 2016, when 20 years of buried shame and resentment came to a deadly climax at a high school reunion, as past bullying finally caught up with its perpetrator in the most tragic way possible. Lisa Park, 38, had been the victim of relentless bullying throughout high school, particularly from popular student council president Gavin Pierce and his circle of friends. The harassment had been systematic and cruel, involving public humiliation, social isolation, and psychological torture that had left lasting scars on Lisa's psyche. Gavin, now 38 and a successful marketing executive for a major advertising firm, had never acknowledged or apologized for his role in Lisa's trauma. He had built a successful career on his charisma and social skills, the same qualities that had made him a powerful bully in high school. Lisa had spent 2 decades building a successful career as a forensic accountant, using her analytical skills and attention to detail to uncover financial fraud for major corporations. Despite her professional success, she had struggled with relationships and self-esteem issues that traced directly back to her high school trauma. The reunion was held at an upscale lakeside resort, where many classmates were staying overnight, creating an atmosphere of nostalgia and celebration. Lisa had decided to attend specifically to confront Gavin about the past, hoping for some acknowledgement or apology that might help her find closure. When she finally approached Gavin during the evening social hour, he was surrounded by the same group of friends who had participated in the bullying 20 years earlier. Lisa attempted to have a private conversation with Gavin about how the bullying had affected her life, explaining the suicide attempt, the therapy, and the ongoing struggles with self-worth and relationships. Gavin's response was devastating. He dismissed Lisa's concerns with the same cruelty he had shown in high school, claiming Lisa was being overly dramatic and needed to get over it after all these years. The confrontation moved to the resort's lakeside dock, when Gavin suggested they continue their conversation away from the crowd. The wooden dock stretched over water nearly 12 feet deep, where the lake bed dropped off sharply from the shore. A few aging lamps cast faint reflections across the dark surface as Gavin continued his verbal assault, telling Lisa she was still the same pathetic loser she had been in high school. When Lisa began crying, Overwhelmed by the realization that Gavin had learned nothing and felt no remorse, Gavin pushed her and threatened to throw her in the lake like old times, referencing a particularly traumatic incident from their senior year. Lisa, overwhelmed by decades of suppressed rage and fresh humiliation, grabbed Gavin's arm as he shoved her. In the struggle, Gavin lost his balance on the slick boards, pulling Lisa with him, as they both plunged into the cold, dark water. Gavin, who had been drinking heavily throughout the evening and was wearing an expensive suit, immediately began struggling to stay afloat in the frigid water. Lisa, who had become a strong swimmer as part of her therapy and self-improvement efforts, could have easily helped Gavin reach the safety of the dock or shore. Instead, she treaded water and watched as Gavin panicked, his alcohol-impaired coordination making it difficult for him to swim effectively. Gavin's struggles became increasingly desperate as the cold water sapped his strength and his heavy clothing dragged him down. He called out for help, his voice echoing across the lake. But Lisa remained motionless in the water, watching her former tormentor fight for his life. Lisa swam to shore and climbed out, claiming Gavin had fallen in accidentally while they were talking near the dock. Several reunion guests nearby heard the argument growing louder, and then a sudden splash, though the darkness made it hard to see what actually happened on the lake. The investigation revealed Lisa's motive and her deliberate failure to rescue Gavin despite being an excellent swimmer and having multiple opportunities to save him. It was January 15th, 2020, when Rebecca Lawson's prestigious medical career came to a devastating end, as her history of negligence and arrogance finally caught up with her in the most personal and tragic way possible. Rebecca, 52, was a renowned cardiac surgeon whose exceptional technical skills were overshadowed by her arrogance, substance abuse, and willingness to cut corners when it suited her schedule or financial interests. Nurse Nora Martinez, 29, had worked under Rebecca for 3 years in the cardiac surgery unit and had witnessed multiple instances of negligence, patient abuse, and dangerous shortcuts that put lives at risk. Martinez had filed numerous complaints with hospital administration, documenting instances where Rebecca had operated while intoxicated, falsified medical records, and blamed complications on other staff members to avoid responsibility. However, Rebecca's reputation as a skilled surgeon and her ability to generate revenue for the hospital made her virtually untouchable. The breaking point came when Rebecca's negligence during a routine cardiac procedure resulted in the death of Martinez's 8-year-old nephew, Miguel, who had been born with a correctable heart defect. Martinez discovered that Rebecca had been drinking heavily before Miguel's surgery, consuming alcohol in her office during her lunch break before entering the operating room. During the procedure, Rebecca made critical errors that directly caused Miguel's death. She punctured the child's aorta while attempting to repair the septal defect, causing massive internal bleeding that could not be controlled. Miguel died on the operating table after nearly an hour of uncontrolled bleeding, while Rebecca and the team struggled to stabilize him, not out of duty, but to avoid the consequences of her negligence. After Miguel's death, Rebecca falsified medical records to make it appear that the child had died from unexpected complications rather than a surgical error. When Martinez attempted to report the truth to authorities, Rebecca used her influence to have Martinez fired and blacklisted from other hospitals in the region. Martinez's sister was devastated by Miguel's death and never recovered from the loss of her only child. Martinez spent months planning her revenge, using her medical knowledge and access to hospital supplies to devise what she believed would be an untraceable method of murder. She obtained a job at a private surgical clinic, where Rebecca occasionally performed procedures for wealthy patients. The opportunity came on a day when Rebecca arrived at the clinic suffering from severe food poisoning. Despite her obvious illness, nausea, vomiting, and dehydration, she refused to cancel her scheduled surgery on a wealthy businessman, driven by her pride and the substantial fee involved. Standard medical protocol required her to stay off duty to protect both her health and that of her patients, but she insisted on receiving IV fluids and medication to stabilize herself before operating. As Rebecca lay in the treatment room, hooked to an IV and basic monitors, she was groggy from the anti-nausea medication, but still responsive. When the other nurse stepped out briefly, Martinez took her chance. She slipped a syringe into the IV port and slowly injected potassium chloride, a substance that, in high doses, stops the heart by disrupting its electrical rhythm. The clinic stocked potassium chloride for routine post-operative care in pre-mixed IV solutions. Martinez, familiar with the supply system, had quietly drawn several doses into a syringe earlier that day. The drug was kept in a locked cabinet, but staff access was loosely monitored, a common gap in smaller private facilities. Within about a minute, Rebecca's monitors erupted as her heartbeat faltered and then flatlined. To the team rushing back in, the collapse appeared to be a sudden complication from her illness. Despite repeated defibrillation and cardiac medications, she could not be revived. Clinic security reviewed footage of Martinez's activities during Rebecca's treatment, and toxicology later confirmed abnormally high potassium levels inconsistent with her medical condition. Martinez was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During her trial, she showed no remorse for Rebecca's death, stating that she had prevented the surgeon from killing more innocent patients and that justice had finally been served for Miguel and all of Rebecca's other victims. It was February 14th, 2017, when Cameron Doyle's manipulative nature finally caught up with her in the most horrific way imaginable. The 29-year-old wedding photographer had built her reputation on capturing perfect moments, but behind the lens lurked a woman who thrived on destroying the very love she pretended to celebrate. Cameron specialized in high-end weddings along California's coast, using her access to intimate moments to gather compromising information about her clients. Her calculating personality and sharp eye for human weakness made her a master blackmailer. She would photograph guests in compromising positions, capture private conversations, and fabricate evidence when reality didn't serve her purposes. Jake Johnson had been one of her victims. The 32-year-old landscape architect hired Cameron to photograph his engagement party 8 months earlier, never suspecting she would use doctored images to convince his fiancée that he was cheating. The lies destroyed everything Blake held dear: his relationship, his unborn child, and his faith in humanity. While Cameron celebrated another successful manipulation, Blake's world crumbled. His fiancée left, taking their baby, and Blake spiraled into depression and unemployment. But grief transformed into something darker as he began planning his revenge. Cameron maintained a Valentine's Day tradition of visiting Mendocino's cliffside rose garden alone, photographing herself with a single red rose against the sunset. She posted about this ritual extensively on social media, never realizing she was providing Blake with the perfect opportunity. The garden perched 300 feet above jagged rocks and crashing Pacific waves. Blake knew Cameron would arrive at 5:30 p.m., just as she had every February 14th for the past 5 years. He waited in the maze of pathways, watching as she posed with her rose near the cliff's edge. When Blake emerged from the shadows, Cameron initially didn't recognize the broken man whose life she had destroyed. He calmly explained who he was and what her lies had cost him. Cameron's arrogant dismissal quickly turned to panic as she realized the danger. She attempted to flee toward the garden entrance, but Blake blocked her path. During the violent struggle, Cameron dropped her rose as Blake grabbed her wrist. In a moment of pure rage, he shoved her backward with both hands. Cameron stepped back, and the loose soil at the cliff's edge crumbled beneath her feet. She plunged the full 300 feet down the rocky cliff face, her body striking multiple granite outcroppings before crashing onto the rocks below. The devastating impact shattered her ribs and fractured her skull, killing her instantly. Hours later, rescuers found her broken body on the rocks, the red rose lying beside her in the debris. The scene initially appeared to be an accidental fall during a photography session. However, investigators eventually uncovered Jake's connection to Cameron and evidence of premeditation. The case revealed the dark side of Cameron's photography business and the lives she had destroyed through her manipulations. Jake was arrested for first-degree murder, though he maintained that justice had finally been served for all of Cameron's victims. The investigation uncovered at least 12 other couples whose relationships Cameron had deliberately sabotaged for her own twisted entertainment and financial gain. It was August 15th, 2018, when Renee Callister's childhood cruelty finally caught up with her. The 31-year-old marketing executive had built a successful career, but her polished exterior concealed the heart of a vicious bully who had never faced consequences for the psychological torture she inflicted on vulnerable children. Renee possessed a narcissistic personality that made her incapable of genuine empathy. Even as an adult, she viewed others as objects for her entertainment, dismissing the pain she caused with casual indifference. Her social media showcased a perfect life, filled with luxury vacations and designer clothes, funded by her ruthless corporate tactics. 20 years earlier, at Camp Wildwood, Renee had been the ringleader of systematic abuse against Jordan Whitaker. The shy 12-year-old became her favorite target, enduring daily humiliation that included being forced to eat garbage, having his belongings destroyed, and being locked in storage closets for hours. Renee's cruelty drove Jordan to write a suicide note, though he never followed through. Jordan Whitaker, now 33, had spent decades in therapy recovering from the trauma Renee inflicted. The former victim worked as a property caretaker for the county, which gave him access to the abandoned Camp Wildwood. While Renee thrived in her corporate world, Jordan struggled with depression and anxiety that stemmed directly from her childhood torture. The camp had been closed for 15 years, its buildings slowly rotting in the wilderness. Jordan maintained the property, walking daily through the locations where his innocence had been destroyed. He kept his childhood suicide note as a reminder of how close Renee had pushed him to the edge. Renee's Instagram posts revealed her plan to visit the old camp for a nostalgic photo shoot. She wanted to recreate childhood memories for her lifestyle blog, completely oblivious to the pain those memories represented. Jordan saw this as divine justice finally presenting itself after 2 decades of waiting. On that August afternoon, Renee arrived alone at 2 p.m., her expensive camera equipment contrasting sharply with the decaying surroundings. She posed cheerfully in locations where she had once tormented children, treating the abandoned camp like a backdrop for social media content. Jordan emerged from the old dining hall, carrying his childhood suicide note. When he confronted her with the evidence of what her cruelty had nearly caused, Renee's reaction was everything Jordan expected. She laughed, dismissing their childhood interactions as harmless fun while showing zero remorse. Her complete lack of remorse triggered something primal in Jordan. 20 years of suppressed rage exploded as he chased her through the rotting camp buildings toward the old rope course, where she had once pushed him off platforms and cut his safety ropes for entertainment. Renee became entangled in deteriorated rope obstacles 30 feet above the ground. The equipment was now a death trap of frayed cables and rotting wood. Jordan stood below, watching as Renee begged for help, while he recited every cruel thing she had done to him and other vulnerable children. The rope finally snapped. Renee plummeted 30 feet onto broken wooden posts that had once supported camp signs. One pierced through her abdomen while another fractured her spine, paralyzing her instantly. She remained conscious for only minutes, experiencing a brief but intense moment of helplessness she had once inflicted on others, before succumbing to massive blood loss. Jordan left her body at the camp and reported finding her the next day during his routine inspection. The investigation initially supported accidental death, but Jordan's connection to Renee eventually led to his arrest for murder. It was March 22, 2016, when Blake Thornton's reckless disregard for human life finally led to his own violent death on a dark Tennessee highway. The 28-year-old came from a wealthy family whose connections had repeatedly saved him from facing real consequences for his dangerous behavior. Blake worked as a trust fund manager at his family's investment firm. His privileged upbringing had created an arrogant personality that viewed rules as suggestions for lesser people. He treated his multiple DUI arrests as minor inconveniences. Exactly 1 year earlier, Blake had been driving drunk when he struck and killed 6-year-old Emma Lowell in a crosswalk outside her elementary school. The little girl was walking home when Blake's speeding BMW sent her small body flying 30 feet through the air. He fled the scene immediately. Trina Lowell, Emma's 34-year-old mother, watched her only child take her final breath in the hospital that night. The single mother had devoted her entire life to raising Emma. Blake's wealthy family hired expensive lawyers who got him probation, claiming the child had darted into traffic. The injustice consumed Trina completely. She quit her job as a dental hygienist and spent the entire year studying Blake's patterns. She learned he visited Murphy's Tavern every Tuesday night, always leaving around 11:30 p.m. completely intoxicated. His route home took him down Highway 67, a winding mountain road. Trina spent months obsessing over revenge. Online forums and repair manuals taught her how cars worked, and she practiced on junkyard wrecks until her hands moved with mechanical precision. For weeks, Trina followed Blake to Murphy's Tavern parking lot, waiting until he was inside drinking before sliding beneath his silver BMW. She studied every inch of the undercarriage, rehearsing exactly where and how to strike. That fatal Tuesday night, while Blake was inside bragging about beating another DUI charge, Trina made her move. She slipped behind the front wheel well and severed the brake line with one precise cut, deep enough to ensure total failure but hidden well enough to pass a casual glance. At 11:30 p.m., Blake stumbled to his car, completely unaware that his vehicle had just been transformed into a death trap by a grieving mother seeking justice. At mile marker 23, Blake approached the sharp curve where he had previously crashed without consequence. This time, when he pressed the brake pedal, it sank uselessly to the floor. The severed brake line left him with no stopping power, and the BMW carried its full speed straight toward the guardrail at 55 miles per hour. Blake yanked the wheel desperately, but the heavy car barely responded. With no way to slow down, the vehicle plowed through the metal guardrail and became airborne over the 150-foot embankment. For 3 terrifying seconds, Blake experienced the same helplessness his victim had felt. The BMW flipped 3 times down the rocky slope. Blake's body was thrown violently around the interior as windows exploded and the roof collapsed. During the second flip, his neck snapped against the door frame, instantly paralyzing him. Blake remained conscious but unable to move as gasoline leaked from the ruptured fuel tank. Broken glass had shredded his face and arms, while twisted metal pinned his legs. He could smell the gas fumes growing stronger. Blake lay trapped and paralyzed, his broken neck and massive internal injuries stealing his strength within minutes. In those final moments, he finally understood the terror his victim had experienced. He slipped into unconsciousness from blood loss before death claimed him. Trina had been visiting Emma's grave during the crash, establishing a perfect alibi. The investigation initially ruled it another drunk driving accident. However, forensic analysis eventually revealed the mechanical sabotage, leading investigators to Trina. It was December 8, 2019, when Sabrina Lowell's home-wrecking affair finally led to her death in the most brutal way imaginable. The 29-year-old real estate agent had built her career on charm and manipulation, but her greatest conquest would become her downfall when she targeted the wrong family. Sabrina possessed a narcissistic personality that thrived on stealing what belonged to others. She specialized in targeting married men, viewing their wives as obstacles rather than human beings with feelings. Her stunning looks and calculated seduction techniques had ended dozens of marriages without any remorse for the destruction she caused. Sabrina had seduced David Anderson, a successful architect married to Kelly Anderson. She systematically targeted him during house showings, using her real estate expertise to create intimate situations. She convinced him that his wife didn't appreciate him, and that he deserved someone better who understood his ambitions. Kelly Anderson, 35, had been married to David for 12 years and was raising their twin daughters when Sabrina entered their lives like a predator. The devoted mother worked part-time as a bookkeeper to support David's career, never suspecting her husband was having an affair with their real estate agent. When David left his family, he drained their joint bank accounts and moved in with Sabrina, using their life savings. Kelly discovered the affair through credit card statements, showing expensive hotel stays and jewelry purchases. Watching her 8-year-old daughters cry themselves to sleep, asking why daddy didn't love them, transformed her grief into murderous rage. Sabrina flaunted the relationship on social media, posting photos of expensive vacations and designer gifts that David bought with his family's money. She showed no remorse for destroying a marriage and seemed to enjoy the power she held over both David and his abandoned family. The Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami had been their regular meeting place during the affair. Sabrina booked the same penthouse suite monthly, creating a romantic sanctuary where she had systematically stolen another woman's husband. Kelly learned about these getaways through private investigator reports and credit card records. On that December evening, Kelly intercepted David's phone and sent Sabrina a text asking her to meet at their usual suite. Sabrina arrived at 7 p.m. expecting a romantic evening, completely unaware that the betrayed wife had been planning this confrontation for months. Kelly was waiting when Sabrina entered with champagne and lingerie, clearly expecting to celebrate another successful manipulation. The confrontation began with Kelly calmly explaining how Sabrina's affair had destroyed her family and left her children traumatized by their father's abandonment. Sabrina showed no remorse and bragged about stealing David, claiming Kelly had been a boring wife who didn't deserve him. She laughed about the children's tears and suggested Kelly should be grateful for being freed from an unhappy marriage. The complete lack of empathy triggered something primal in Kelly. She struck Sabrina with the champagne bottle, causing her to fall and hit her head on the marble coffee table. The blow caused a severe concussion, leaving Sabrina disoriented and unable to defend herself properly. Kelly dragged the dazed Sabrina to the suite's balcony on the 20th floor, overlooking Miami's glittering skyline. She forced her against the balcony railing, gripping her shoulders tightly. Sabrina's head cleared enough to realize the danger. She struggled desperately, clawing at Kelly's hands while pleading for mercy. But Kelly was stronger, fueled by months of rage over every cruel thing Sabrina had said about the children. With one final violent shove, Kelly pushed her over the railing and let gravity do the rest. Sabrina plummeted through the night air, her screams ending when her body struck the pavement 200 feet below. Kelly cleaned the suite and escaped through the service elevator. Security initially believed Sabrina had jumped due to relationship problems. However, the investigation eventually uncovered Kelly's connection and evidence of the confrontation, leading to her arrest. It was November 3, 2015, when Jordan Whitaker's arrogant disregard for patient safety finally caught up with him. The 45-year-old cardiac surgeon had built his reputation on performing unnecessary operations for profit, but his greed would lead to his own death. Jordan possessed an ego that matched his surgical skills, viewing patients as sources of income rather than human beings. His arrogant personality made him believe he was untouchable. He routinely ignored proper procedures and took dangerous shortcuts to maximize profits. 6 months earlier, Jordan had performed a completely unnecessary cardiac procedure on Robert Anderson, a 62-year-old retired teacher who came in for routine chest pain. Despite clear evidence that medication would resolve the issue, Jordan convinced the family that immediate surgery was required. During the operation, Jordan's reckless techniques led to massive complications. Robert suffered a stroke on the operating table due to Jordan's negligent surgical methods. When Robert died 3 days later, Jordan falsified medical records to blame pre-existing conditions. Gina Anderson, Robert's 38-year-old daughter and a surgical nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, knew her father had been healthy before Jordan's unnecessary surgery. She had worked alongside Jordan for years, witnessing his dangerous practices. Her father's death transformed her grief into calculated desire for justice. Working in the same hospital gave Gina intimate knowledge of surgical procedures, medication protocols, and Jordan's personal habits. She discovered that Jordan scheduled his own routine medical procedures during off hours to avoid scrutiny from colleagues. Jordan had scheduled a private gallbladder surgery for himself, using his influence to demand it be done late at night when the hospital was nearly empty. He didn't want colleagues gossiping about his health, and his arrogance made him believe he could bend rules without consequence. At 10 p.m., he arrived for the operation, trusting Gina to prepare his anesthesia, while the skeleton night crew handled other emergencies. His supreme arrogance prevented him from suspecting that the nurse whose father he had killed might seek revenge. Gina had spent months planning the perfect murder. She replaced Jordan's standard anesthesia with a lethal combination of potassium chloride and succinylcholine. The potassium would stop his heart, while the paralytic agent would prevent him from calling for help. As Jordan lay on the operating table, the anesthesiologist injected what he believed was routine pre-operative sedation. But Gina had already swapped the medication, replacing it with the lethal mix. The potassium chloride immediately began disrupting Jordan's cardiac rhythm, while the succinylcholine paralyzed his respiratory muscles, leaving him unable to breathe or call for help. Within 90 seconds, Jordan experienced complete cardiac arrest, but remained fully conscious due to the paralytic agent preventing him from speaking or moving. His brain continued functioning for approximately 4 minutes while his body was completely paralyzed. He experienced the absolute terror of conscious death, unable to move, speak, or breathe as his organs systematically shut down. His eyes remained open and aware until his brain succumbed to oxygen deprivation. Jordan, who had caused so many unnecessary deaths through his surgical arrogance, died experiencing the same helplessness his victims had felt. His body was discovered by the night shift supervisor 20 minutes later. Gina disposed of the evidence and reported finding Jordan's body during routine checks. The death was initially attributed to sudden cardiac arrest from work-related stress. However, routine toxicology reports eventually revealed the modified anesthesia cocktail. The investigation uncovered Gina's access to restricted medications and her motive. Security footage ultimately led to her arrest for premeditated murder. It was June 18, 2017, when Molly Anderson's financial predatory behavior finally led to her brutal death in an isolated Colorado mountain cabin. The 32-year-old financial advisor had built her career on stealing from the most vulnerable members of society, but her greed would cost her everything. Molly possessed a charming personality that masked her sociopathic tendencies and complete lack of empathy for elderly victims. She specialized in targeting seniors with dementia, using her credentials to gain trust before systematically draining their life savings. 3 months earlier, Molly had targeted 78-year-old Margaret Doyle, a retired librarian living in a modest nursing home. Using forged documents and Margaret's stolen identity, Molly transferred the elderly woman's entire retirement fund into offshore accounts, leaving her unable to pay for care. Camille Doyle, Margaret's 27-year-old granddaughter, discovered the theft when the nursing home called about unpaid bills. Camille worked as a retail manager and had been Margaret's only family since her parents died. Watching her beloved grandmother cry about losing her home transformed Camille's grief into murderous rage. Camille spent months tracking down the stolen money through bank records. Her investigation led her to Molly, who had already spent Margaret's life savings on luxury cars and expensive vacations. The complete lack of remorse Molly showed when confronted fueled Camille's desire for revenge. Molly owned a remote family cabin in the Colorado mountains, located 50 miles from the nearest town. She used this isolated retreat whenever authorities began investigating her financial crimes, believing the remote location provided perfect cover. Camille learned about the cabin through surveillance and social media posts. She noted that Molly retreated there whenever she felt threatened by law enforcement, always traveling alone with no security systems or neighbors for miles. On that June evening, Molly arrived at the cabin planning to lay low until her latest investigation cooled down. She had recently stolen from 3 more elderly victims and needed time for the heat to die down. Camille had been watching the cabin for weeks, learning Molly's routines and preparing for the perfect opportunity. She waited until Molly was settled inside before making her move, knowing no one would hear the screams in the isolated wilderness. Camille confronted Molly at the cabin, presenting detailed evidence of the theft and demanding the return of her grandmother's money. When Molly laughed and claimed the elderly woman was too senile to manage money anyway, Camille's rage exploded into violence. She attacked Molly with a fireplace poker, fracturing her skull and knocking her unconscious. Camille then tied the unconscious Molly to a chair in the cabin's basement and waited for her to regain consciousness before revealing her plan for prolonged torture. Over the next several hours, Camille systematically broke Molly's fingers and toes with a hammer while forcing her to watch videos of Margaret crying about losing her home. She wanted Molly to understand the pain she had caused to innocent people. Camille used a knife to slowly carve dollar signs into Molly's arms and chest, symbolizing the money she had stolen from vulnerable seniors. Each cut was deliberate and calculated to maximize pain while keeping Molly conscious as long as possible. Molly finally died from shock and blood loss after hours of systematic torture. Her body bore evidence of Camille's methodical revenge, with dozens of cuts spelling out the word thief across her torso. Camille set fire to the cabin with Molly's body still inside, believing the flames would erase every trace of her revenge. She drove back to the city, confident that investigators would find nothing more than an accidental fire. However, forensic experts later discovered fractures in the charred remains that pointed to violent assault before death. Combined with financial records linking Camille to Molly and evidence of premeditation, the investigation built a solid case. The death was reclassified from accidental to homicide, leading to Camille's arrest for first-degree murder. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now